I would have been so scared if I was them. With this video alone, you can immediately see all the challenges the Ukrainians faced during the Kherson offensive. Frontal assaults across flat, open terrain. Overall, there are very few wooded areas. Once you attack, you're pretty much in the open for a while, where any denivellation slope of the terrain has to be carefully used to your advantage, like you can see on screen. The tactical situation here is also very interesting. Here you see what seems to be a motorized platoon, consisting of multiple squads of 12 men, in column formation behind a Dutch YRP 765 armored vehicle. And to their left you see a Polish T-72 M1 for suppressive fire. And notice that only the hull is visible to the enemy. Anyway, just looking at that must be scary as hell. They did it. Ukraine actually did it. I did not believe they would do it, but the Great Kherson Offensive has been launched. Thing is, for both Ukraine and Russia, this is perhaps the most decisive battle of the war. And it's not a small attack. Ukraine literally attacked all over the front line. Not once, but 3 times. 3 waves of attacks. And Russian commanders were pissing their pants. Ukrainians actually managed to break through in many places. Now, after 4 days, who is winning? This is what you'll discover in this video. We'll look at all the details. All I can say is that August 29th, the first day of the offensive, might be the bloodiest day in modern Ukrainian history. Hi and welcome to History Legends. Here are the latest news about the Russo-Ukrainian war. Here we cut the BS and talk about what the media doesn't tell you. As always, information changes by the hour, so if you have any new info, just comment it below. If you're new to this channel, make sure to check out my Ukraine playlist so you don't miss anything I've said in the past. And today is my birthday, September 1st, which strangely coincides with the start of World War II. Anyway, I'm gonna be celebrating the day eating a big cake. She's there to just hurt me. If you want to support me on this glorious day, make sure to subscribe to my Patreon or have a look at my PayPal. The links are in the description. Thank you to everyone that has already helped. Because of you, the show keeps running. With that being said, welcome to the headquarters. Why did Ukraine attack? Little Birds reported that Boris Johnson urged Zelensky to attack, to launch a counteroffensive immediately, because the next meeting of the contact group for the defense of Ukraine, the so-called Ramstein 5, will be held on the 8th of September in Germany, where it will be decided how many more weapons will be sent to Ukraine. Zelensky has to impress his Western backers and convince them that Ukraine is still capable of defeating Russia and that Ukrainians can also regain lost territory. So I'm telling you, the next few days might be very rocky on the front line. Kherson offensive overview. On the night of August 28th to the 29th, the armed forces of Ukraine massively shelled Russian positions, after which they launched their ground offensive. From the discussion I had with DPA, Military Summary and War in Ukraine, the Ukraine operation involved 30,000 to 36,000 men, with 10,000 men as spearhead for the strike force. It's not the ragtag territorial units you can find in Donbass. We're talking about units with high morale, excellent training, and lots of heavy equipment. However, right off the bat, there was this weird article from CNN. US war game with Ukraine ahead of counteroffensive and encourage more limited mission. So clearly the Pentagon was involved in planning this offensive. Here it says the Ukrainians were initially considering a broader counteroffensive, but narrowed the mission to the south, to the Kherson region. And it's clear that the US is heavily involved in Ukraine. It literally says it. The United States has routine military-to-military dialogue at multiple levels with Ukraine. But by reading this article, it's clear that the Americans are washing their hands of this operation by saying that they only provide advice, but the Ukrainians have the last word on what to do. Anyway, that was a very weird article. Overall, the Kherson offensive was divided in 3 strikes. Each had the objective of reaching the Dnieper and cutting Russian forces. 1 strike from Kherson to capture the Antonov Bridge, 1 strike in the center towards Novakarovka to capture the dam crossing over the Dnieper, and lastly an attack in the north in the flank of the Russian forces. Then Ukrainians, with their second echelon, with the mobile reserves, would concentrate their forces where they actually broke through, and limit offensives that failed. For this offensive to work, Ukrainians made great use of HIMARS and artillery to knock out the bridges on the Dnieper, so that Russian reinforcements on the other side of the Dnieper would have a hard time crossing over to help their comrades. And perhaps by the time they arrive, the battle will already be done. Ukrainians were also pretty successful at destroying Russian pontoon bridges built in exchange for the damaged bridges over the river. But the big challenge of the Ukraine army would be, once they attack, to pinpoint Russian artillery positions and destroy them immediately. Otherwise, they're going to have a very hard time. On the other side, Russians have allegedly 20 to 25,000 men defending the Kherson salient. The Russian disposition was pretty simple. A thinly defended front line with many anti-tank missiles, with the bulk of the forces at the rear as mobile reserves units capable to counterattack if needed. Mobility and cohesion was the main strength of this Russian grouping. But we see right away 30,000, 35,000 Ukrainians against 20 to 25,000 Russians. Mathematically, Ukrainians would need at least 3 times that amount. And you'll discover why in a second. The first 2 days. What's interesting is that Russian artillery observers notice assembling areas of the Ukraine army in certain sectors. Strange regrouping of forces that could only mean imminent assault. So the Russian artillery preemptively strike these positions, causing an unknown amount of casualties. They also preemptively striked places where they thought these columns would advance. Let's start with the attack in the south. It was said that it involved around 2 BTGs, 2,000 men about. The main axis of attack was Posad Pokrovsky, along the M14 highway directly going towards Kherson. One of the Ukraine columns even managed to reach the town of Kiselivka, but Russian reserves counterattacked and pushed them back to Soldatsky. This attack in the center was also supported by 3 other attacks. Ukrainians attempted to break through at Oleksandrivka, Ternopody, and Blahodatne. In this area, we're talking about open steppe terrain, the one we saw early in the video. Essentially, how Ukrainians attack is that they had armored vehicles and tanks in front and infantry companies walking behind them. That's the only way you can do it. And during one of these attacks, it was said that the Ukrainians lost 5 armored vehicles and half the infantry company was killed or wounded. So in the south, if I recall, it's the Russian airborne units. They held their ground. In the north, the Ukrainians attacked where they attacked already in the past, at Vyskopilye and Oline. Here the fighting is very confusing. There's a lot of back and forth. One unit capturing the village, the Russians retreating, then they counterattack. It was very messy. There was heavy fighting. And for many days, nobody knew what was actually going on. However, it seems that the main strike of the Ukrainian offensive was in the center, along the Inulets River. Crossing over a river is very complicated, as we've seen many times during this conflict. It seems the objective for the Ukrainians was to enlarge the bridgehead of Davydiv Brid, expand it both in the north and in the south. As you know, the larger a bridgehead, the more secure it is. From there, they would call victory and they could stop there. And if the Russian front collapses, they could make a rush for it towards Novakharovka, which would be a decisive victory. It would split Russian forces in 2 and capture a river crossing across the Dnieper. What ended up happening is that a force that attacked north of Davydiv Brid at Mala Oleksandrivka, I'm very sorry for all the villages, but it's for map purposes. This attack in the north was repulsed. However, some Ukrainians managed to take hold of Davydiv Brid and knock out the first line of Russian defenses. But once again, the fighting is very confusing. We don't really know who holds what. We only know that the Ukrainians did not take the entire village, but they're there. The big offensive happened at the south of Davydiv Brid between Andrivka and Lozove. Ukraine surprised the Russians. Instead of reusing an already existing pontoon bridge, they built at least 3 new ones across the Inulets River. And through these positions, they poured 1 tank company and 2 infantry battalions of Marines, supported by dozens of infantry fighting vehicles, and altogether, they broke through Russian lines. Breakthrough is even an underestimate of what happened. They smashed through Russian lines. After this initial success of their mission, they divided their strike group in 2. One group attacked south against Blagodatovka in an attempt to cut off the highway and capture the village. But this attack was repulsed. It's the second group that made the most decisive advance. They made a 6-kilometer advance across the steppe and captured the village of Sury-Stavok. Thing is, I say it's a village, but it's more like an 800-meter long street with houses on both sides. You can't defend it, nor should you want to. In this area, for the offensive to succeed, Ukrainians have to push as far as possible, no matter the cost, because staying where they are will just be more costly. So this column kept pressing their advantage towards Kostromka and even reached the outskirts of Bruskinske, where they were eventually stopped by Russian 2S9 self-propelled guns. The aftermath of the first 2 days. The Ukrainians faced a relative success. They managed to break through at one place, but the other positions stalled. What happened is that the Ukrainian General Staff quickly abandoned all the other secondary offensives and redirected all its reserves towards Andriivka. If Ukraine expects to win, they need to bring the second echelon and a lot of reinforcements into that bridgehead as soon as possible. This is what they seem to have done. I looked over on Defense Politics Asia's map, and there were one reports of 20 armored vehicles, another of 70 armored vehicles directing from the rear towards this area. All these troops were sent between Andriivka and Davydiv Brid. It's possible that a lot of these troops were actually motorized rifle companies that attacked against Posad Pokrovsk and that were just redirected to another place. And overall, according to the reports, the Ukrainians managed to build a second line of 3 assault battalions. But really, the Ukrainian General Staff now was worried of a Russian counterattack against Mykolaiv, so they brought all the forces from Odessa, all the forces on the southern front, they brought them all in. Now, what was surprising is that on most of the front line, the Russians used tactical retreats as their main strategy. They know their main strength is artillery fire, so just like the Mongols would do, they would feint a retreat, lure the attackers into open ground, and always avoid contact with the attacking force. And at once, Russian artillery bombards these exposed troops. So that's why the situation was very confusing. Some moments there was a Russian retreat, then a counterattack, and this movement happened a lot. Another group pushed north towards these forested areas along the river and captured Bilohirka. In the center, it was clear that the Ukrainians actually managed to secure a bridgehead and even enlarge it to a certain level. So the offensive was a success. The problem is, on the night of August 30th, the second day, the Russian Ministry of Defense showed some Ukrainian casualty reports. Of course, take it with a pinch of salt, but it's the only data we have. They claimed the loss of 1,200 Ukrainian military personnel destroyed. To me, that sounds like KIA. In that case, it's horrific. Add another 2,000 wounded and you get 25 to 30% losses within the first 48 hours. And if the 1,200 includes both KA and wounded, it's still 12% casualties in 2 days. For NATO formations, that means unit destroyed and cannot continue fighting. And of course, for us modern Western analysts, it seems very high, but remember that during World War II, on the Eastern Front, shock units would often have these exact rates of casualties, sometimes higher, 50, even 100% casualties were not rare, as long as they fulfilled their mission. The problem today is that these Ukrainian units that attacked were mechanized infantry. The elite of the Ukrainian armed forces, you can't simply replace these men. A lot of them were the ones that have actually been trained in Britain. Weeks and weeks of training, and 2 days later, half of them are gone. So the British training program is good, but Ukraine needs 10 times that amount to really make a difference on the front line. As for heavy equipment, this is one of the first times we see a lot of Ukrainian vehicles being destroyed. Reminds me of the first day of the Russian offensive. The Russians claim to have destroyed 48 enemy tanks, most of them the modernized Polish T-72M1. Here you can see footage of a Ukrainian column consisting of 3 of these tanks, a BMP, and a couple trucks that was ambushed reportedly around Vyskopilya in the north. Also notice the use of civilian trucks to transport supplies, which strangely coincides with this picture. Possibly Ukraine requisitioned civilian trucks for the offensive. So now we're all waiting for the Western media to mock the Ukrainians for using civilian equipment, right? No, maybe not? Okay. Anyway, I don't know why people would even laugh at anyone using civilian trucks. It's not very different from a military truck. There's different painting, that's it. And lastly, the Russian Ministry of Defense also reported that Ukraine lost 46 armored fighting vehicles and 37 lightly armored combat trucks. That's a lot of equipment. Some say that it was 30% of the strike force that was lost in 2 days. But like we said before, casualties are okay if it reaches the objective. And just like German journalist Julian Röpke said, I think we can also agree that this push resulted in many casualties among Ukrainian soldiers and very few to no gained territory. The push is over for now. I think this justifies the term failure. Also, a lot of the mechanized units sent to attack were not familiar with the area. There was the story of 12 Ukrainian armored vehicles pushing forward, when they were stopped by a Russian artillery barrage. They withdrew, but since they were poorly briefed, they retreated into a Ukrainian minefield and only 5 vehicles made it back. But overall, fighting was very intense on the first day, the 29th, and the following day on the 30th, it calmed down. But it was just a calm before the storm. Day 3. Day 3 was critical. After pausing the offensive on day 2, if Ukrainians did not move after day 3, the offensive would be dead, stalled, dead in its tracks. The most important for Ukraine, just like the Allies on D-Day, is to expand the breachhead at all costs. And this explains the next action. They went back on the offensive. In the north, Ukraine sent more and more troops to try to capture Vyskopilye, but the Russian forces held their ground. So then the Ukrainians attempted to bypass this position at a town that I'm gonna pronounce it as Arkhangelsk. But what's interesting is that after a couple days, we can clearly see the Ukraine plan. From the north, the maneuver was not to outflank the entire Russian army, but simply to push down this road and link up with the attack at Davydiv Brid, and thus create a large breachhead in the north. In the center, Ukraine, after momentarily losing control over Sury-Stavok, they used the force between Andrivka and Lozove along the river to regroup. The most important victory for the Ukrainians that day was the attack on Bilorivka, where they fought through along the forest at the riverside, thus expanding the breachhead and giving them more air to breathe. They were also one step away from Davydiv Brid. They only had to break that last Russian line of defense. At the same time, Ukrainian assault battalions went back into the steppe. This time, they rammed Russian forces at Sury-Stavok and continued their attack at Kostromka and reached the outskirts of Bruskinske for good. If they captured this village, they would put the Russian forces at Davydiv Brid in a very jeopardy position. I'm telling you, my English is not the best. And it's actually going to be worse when I come back from my trip, because I'm leaving tomorrow. So this video is my birthday gift to you. So summary, from Bruskinske, Ukrainians can flank and attack the rear of Russian forces at Davydiv Brid, but also push south, perhaps even reach Novakarovka and stop Russian reinforcements coming up that road from intervening in the battle. This operation just smells NATO planning. It's well planned. I'm sure on the war game, the troops moved fast, there was nice arrows, encirclements and all. We can see that it was well thought. But fighting is difficult and plans often don't resist first contact. Now the risk for the Ukrainians there is that they hold only a tiny corridor where they can be fired at from both sides if they don't receive reinforcements or link up with other forces, enlarge their breachhead, I don't know. They're cooked, they're done. They will be isolated and deep into enemy territory. And just think of how can supplies and reinforcements arrive to support their attack. They will have to cross Russian artillery kill zones. There's only 1 or 2 roads. Some people even said that this was a well-planned Russian trap. Lure the enemy far from their base, encircle and destroy. This is essentially what they did at the Battle of Ilovaisk. So at this point, Ukrainians have to send more and more reinforcements immediately to that place. Oh yeah, little note that goes hand in hand with the Russian trap theory is that the Russians bombarded the Ukrainians before the offensive. So they knew something was going to happen. They let the Ukrainians cross over the Inulets River, yet they did not destroy the pontoon crossings. Normally, that's the first thing you would do. They didn't. And then they lured the enemy far from the other groupings. I don't know. And it also seems they knew where the Ukrainians would launch their main strike. Maybe I'm overthinking, let me know in the comment section. Now further in the south, Ukrainians also got some significant success by capturing the villages of Lyubomirivka and Ternovi Podi. And once again they were expanding towards Kiselivka, but this time from the north. So the day looked bright for the Ukrainians until the late night news arrived from the front line. Apparently on day 3, Ukrainians lost another 500 men, putting the total to 1,700, 2,000. Russian forces counterattacked in many places. The Russian grouping that successfully defended Alexandrivka moved up to Kiselivka and kicked the Ukrainians out of this position and are now counterattacking in the flank of the Ukrainian offensive. I told you, the Russian mobile units, very good in this sector. Same thing at Sury-Stavok. Out of nowhere, Russian columns attacked the flanks of this corridor and pushed the Ukrainians back from Bruskinske and even from Kostromka. Only in the north, the Russians apparently had to withdraw from Vernopilye at least for a couple hours. It says they still control the position, but it's very confusing. Day 4. Ukrainians continue to push where they were already pushing. The Ukraine column this time at Kostromka tried to push south, and we don't really know what happened. They renewed attacks against Davydiv Brid and in the sector of Bilohirka. It was also reported that Ukrainian forces withdrew from Ternovi Podi, but nobody knows if the Russians actually reconquered this position. And according to the latest news, the Russians are in fact still controlling the villages of Oline and Vyskopilya. And fighting is also taking place in the northern outskirts of Arkhangelsk. Overall, it seems the great Ukraine triple counteroffensive to end the war has run out of steam after 4 days. Mostly because of a lack of reserves ready to intervene. Who planned this? What was the purpose of this offensive? Apparently, after 4 days of combat, the Ukrainian 128th Mountain Brigade from Transcarpathia, the west of Ukraine, has been all but annihilated. Or at least it cannot be counted as a combat formation anymore. There are also reports of Russian columns with heavy equipment heading towards Kherson at accelerated speed. Perhaps it will be the start of a Russian offensive on Mykolaiv. Maybe. It's very hard to tell. Overall, what I fear for the Ukrainians is, do they have a second line of defense that can actually hold the Russians in case of a major counteroffensive? Or if all the elite units have been battered and there's only infantry now holding the line? But one interesting fact is that the Ukrainian offensive in Kherson resulted in only 5 Ukrainian soldiers being captured. We see that these men were the elite of the Ukrainian armed forces. They would never surrender. But day 4 is not important for what happened in Kherson, but what happened at the Zaporizhia power plant. Groups of Ukraine commandos trained by the British, by the mighty MI6. But that could also be just the Russians trolling, right? We don't know it for sure, but these are the rumors. Disembarked near the power plant. Now, as it's fresh news, we don't really know what happened, but reportedly Ukraine commandos landed in 5 locations. Some people say as many as 700 commandos. Some say there was one wave and then there was a second wave. If I have more information, I'll let you know. But I think the most believable is that it was 64 commandos in 7 boats, speedboats. However, we know the result. They landed 3 kilometers from the power plant and they were met immediately in a Russian ambush. Russian helicopters took off and blasted the entire bank of the reservoir. It's also curious that this raid is launched as the Kherson offensive is coming to a halt. And with a huge coincidence, it's happening the same day that the personnel of the International Atomic Energy Agency arrived at the location of the nuclear power plant. Very strange. Some even say that the plan for this operation was leaked to the Russians before, and looking at how the Russians are reacting, it's very possible. Perhaps they also knew of the plans at Kherson, who knows? And now there are even talks about a possible Ukrainian offensive on the Kharkiv front. Just to conclude how I see all this happening, it's very possible that the Russians knew about all these plans, and this is perhaps why they remained on the defensive in the last few weeks. And even for the West, it's pretty humiliating how if they help the Ukrainians plan offensives and actually train them, and the plans are leaked, you can bet that they're gonna be pissed. And the Ukraine government has to do everything possible to find the people giving out this information, or they're doomed. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. I have a trip to plan. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, remember to like and subscribe. And if you like the information I provided, make sure to subscribe to my Patreon or check out my PayPal. The links are in the description.